Welcome to the Transportation Planning Environment Committee meeting. Sorry for the late start. We had some tech issues, but I think we've got everybody squared away now. I'm Larkin Eggleston. I am the vice chair of the committee and will be standing in for the chair, Mayor Pro Tem Julie Eisel, today. We'll start with introductions in the room to my left, then go with other committee members and council members, our planning commission members, and then staff and other guests in that order, please. So.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Sam Spencer, Chair, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Planning Commission.
Douglas Welton, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Planning Commission.
Kiba Samuel, Vice Chair, Planning Commission.
Philip Gussman, Planning Commission.
Taiwo Jaba, Planning Director.
Alicia Osborne, Division Manager, Planning.
Other committee members on the call with us today?
Ed Driggs, District 7.
Matt Newton, Committee Member, District 5.
Councilmember Winston will be joining us, but a little bit later. What other planning commission members do we have on with us virtually? Not all at once. Do we have any others with us?
Probably not. We have the executive committee here, so any other planning commission members are probably watching online.
Got it. Staff and other guests in no particular order.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Thank you. This is Liz Babson with the Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Jay Rankins with MIG.
This is Matt Prosser with Economic and Planning Systems.
Anybody else? Appreciate you joining us and appreciate your patience today. We are here with one main agenda item. That's the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan and an overview and discussion of that. We are scheduled for 2 hours, though I don't anticipate we will need the full time. I'm going to be monitoring the WebEx, so if anybody who is on with us virtually will use that hand raise function when you've got a question, I'll keep an eye on that. Anyone in the room can just give me the high sign, and I've asked Taiwo to find some natural stopping points where we can catch up with questions we have, as opposed to waiting till the end of what will be likely a 40-plus minute presentation. So we will stop and take questions periodically, so just use that hand raise function as needed. With that, unless there's anything else we need to do to frame our conversation, I will turn it over to Mr. Jaoba.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Eggleston. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Taiwo Jaoba, Planning Director and Assistant City Manager. So last time we came before you was September 28, the regularly scheduled Transportation Planning and Environment Committee. But we also wanted to have the opportunity to have just the members of TAP as well as the executive committee of our planning commission to have an opportunity to come together like this so we can present this to you together. We did a work session with our planning commission as subsequent to the TAP meeting, and we felt it would be good to hear from you because after those meetings, we released the executive summary of the comprehensive plan. I'm not assuming that you've read through them, but maybe you have. But it will be good for us to have a conversation around what that plan looks like when we release the draft to the public on October 31. This is a very important task, as you know, and there could be areas here where we have more conversations than others. And so we're going to try and present, but also make it more conversational, so we will stop frequently, if that's okay with you. Our goal today is, one, take you through these 10 plan goals, talk about the big ideas again, you're familiar with some of those, discuss how all the pieces fit together, understand the financial piece, and also the process that we have mapped going forward. So we're going to take minimum amount of time to present because you've seen some of these slides before. But I also would like to know what your takeaways are from the executive summary and what we can do better with this plan so to make sure that the community understands the process. So I'll start with these these plan goals. There's 10 of them, as you know. Obviously, the one that people talk a lot about is how we envision that this plan will lay the platform for creating 10-minute neighborhoods. People ask, how is that going to be possible? And that is because when you're trying to create complete communities, it's important to give people the opportunities to be able to access things that they can without having to drive within 10 minutes of where they live or do business. And so this would not be possible if we were not working also on our strategic mobility plan right now. And that will help to understand how the public transit, walkability, bikeability, how all of those connect with getting people to amenities, goods and services, parks and recreational facilities or opportunities, public health care, shops, housing, jobs, within 10 minutes of where they do life. And the second one, in terms of neighborhood diversity and inclusion, is really about how can we diversify our neighborhoods today. We've talked a lot about the wedge and the crescent and how people, most minority population live in what we call the arc, and then most white population live in what we call the wedge. And then when you look at our city, that's roughly between 70 to 84% exclusively zoned today for single family. How can we diversify the type of housing that we have there in such a way to create an inclusive community? And that's tied to goal number 3 as well, and that is housing needs to be accessible for all. And it's really not just about racial demography, but also in terms of age and physical ability. Charlotte now continues to be number 1 in the country when it comes to baby boomers, and also constantly ranks as top 5 for millennials. I believe U.S. News released their ranking yesterday, and Charlotte is number 6 in terms of best places in the country to live, but subsequently also ranks as number 13 in top best places to retire. You don't often have that happen. And so it's very important that as we think about housing access, we think about our senior population, but we also think about our young population as well, that they should be able to live wherever they want to be able to live, and housing's got to be affordable to them, which also links to goal number 4 in terms of transit. And that's not just about rail transit, but improving frequencies of bus services. But also when you lay out your rail line, you also have to work with the trail as well. We have that right now in our city, where you have the blue line and you have trails alongside it. How can we make sure that as we talk about transit-oriented development, we're talking about trail-oriented development as well, because it brings value to the community where we go to. Of course, when you talk about this, the subject of gentrification comes up, and displacement potentially. But this plan has come up with some ideas as to how can we mitigate displacement, whether to residents or businesses. And then we go to the 6th goal, or the 5th goal, on safe and equitable mobility, and that is that when we are talking about mobility, it shouldn't just be about rail, it shouldn't just be about bus transit, but also about providing accessibility to people, sidewalks, ability for people to feel safe when they're moving in the community. We talked about Vision Zero, minimizing fatality, pedestrian fatality to bicyclists. So how can we make sure that we continue to assure that as we build a city over the next 20 years? We talk a lot about how community, we have food deserts in the city. One of the questions that Councilmember Eggleston raised last time we were here was, how can we incentivize grocery stores to locate in areas where we have food deserts today? This plan talks about that. How can we create healthy communities for our people so that people who live far away from full-service grocery stores will still have access to some healthy food and be able to achieve a healthy and active lifestyle? And goal number 7 is very interesting because it's not just about land use, but also a tree canopy. One of the things that makes Charlotte very attractive to a lot of people, the fact is that we have a beautiful tree canopy over this city. So we have a tree canopy action plan going on right now, and it's a beautiful thing that it's happening at the same time as our comprehensive plan, because those policies will help shape the policies that we have. That as we grow and develop, how can we also continue to integrate the natural environment with our built environment as well? And it's not just about the trees, but also the environmental aspect, the benefits of having trees environmentally. It's so important for us to think a lot about that. Goal number 8, in terms of diverse and resilient economic opportunities. This plan is not about housing versus business or economic development. We know that Charlotte has become successful nationally and even internationally in attracting businesses, and we want to make sure that that continues, that this city continues to be positioned to be one of the top that businesses will look at. But while we're looking at that, though, is that we also have to be mindful of the small businesses that are organic to our city and to our region, how we are interested not just in big businesses, but also in small businesses, and continue to make Charlotte that place where you can build resiliency. As a matter of fact, at the end of the day, this plan is really about achieving a resilient city. Resilient, not just from any other perspective, but especially the economic development angle. Very important to us. Goal number 9, in terms of retaining our identity and charm, very crucial. When you look at a lot of cities or communities, one of the things that distinguishes them is the neighborhoods, and Charlotte is not an exception to that. We have some amazing neighborhoods in this city that have been here for so long. How can we continue to protect the charm and identity of those neighborhoods? And then obviously, all of these things that I've just talked about in terms of investment are not achievable unless we really lay out a clear path for how can we fund some of these things without necessarily it being a burden on any particular community or even the public agency, the city. And so all of these goals are tied together, but some may merit more conversations than others. There are some who feel that we need to focus a lot on number 10. There are those who feel that we need to talk more about number 8. There are those who feel that housing diversity is very important. But it's not whether they are more important than the other, but rather that they all work together. So part of what you're going to hear from us today as well is how do all these pieces fit together? The executive summary that we provided to you over the last several days will be released to the public today as well, prior to releasing the document itself on October 31st. It's about 24 pages. It lays out details of these plans, but also some big ideas that are associated with them. I don't know if you've read them, but if you have, I will pause at this point to kind of hear from you what your thoughts are. And then we can skip the rest of the slides and hand off to Jay Rankins of MIG to walk you through how all of these things fit together. So I'll stop here and hand off to you, Councilor Augustine, if anybody virtually or in person has questions. Thank you.
Not seeing any yet, so we'll keep plugging along.
Hey, Larkin, I have my hand up.
Oh. Well.
I don't know what you're seeing, but anyway, if you want me to use the raise hand, I can as well. But so I just wanted to comment, Ty, we don't have to choose between number 10 and number 3. We have to recognize that everything you're talking about here operates in an environment of constraints, of scarcity. So this is not an either or. This is an environment of capacity that we have to be mindful of. And it's ironic that if we actually succeeded in realizing all of these goals, Charlotte would become so attractive that people would flood here and we would start to have problems all over again related to growth. So I am interested to hear what further work has been done to consider the feasibility of achieving all of these things. And I think the most important thing to think about is establishing some priorities. So there might even be, conflicts between some of these priorities and our goals. And it would be very helpful at this stage if we started to think about which one of these we are going to kind of place ahead of the others. because I really don't think, having looked at all of the detailed goals and the individual points on each goal, it's not all going to happen. So the question is, if it isn't all going to happen, which things in there can happen, and which ones will we kind of address more slowly on a more gradual timeline? I think what we have here, and I've got the full 24-page here open on another screen in front of me. We have here a good laundry list of desirables, of aspiration, and we should be aspirational. As I mentioned to you in our last meeting, Ty, I just look forward to what I consider to be the harder part of this process, which is kind of resolving conflicts, operating within some reasonable constraints, recognizing what kind of additional revenue might be necessary to realize these things. Translating all of this into practice is a huge step. So again, if you have more to tell us today about that, I look forward to hearing it. But that is the essence of my concern. I think the goals are all admirable, but I would pick up on one in particular from the presentation, which said we have to devote more than half of our investment resources to the needier neighborhoods. And I don't know if that means corridor investments or what, but that's a pretty profound statement. To establish as a policy for the city that half of the money that is collected in taxes is going to go to places where the money that's collected in taxes is not coming from. And I think we need to be careful about that. There's always a transfer of wealth involved in taxation and public spending, but if we make too clear a priority out of sending the money that we collect in taxes to places other than where the people who are paying the taxes live, that's not going to be popular. So I'll just leave it there. I'm just trying to apply a reality check to this, and not with the intention of thwarting it or anything, but trying to get us to a point where we're being more practical about what we can hope to realize, and we don't overpromise. One example of that is when we talk about tree canopy, and we have a 50 by 50 goal, which I think is becoming clear is unlikely to be attainable given the growth that we expect in Charlotte. So how do we address that? You know, what's the right target to establish for trees in the context of everything else that is in this comprehensive plan, just as a for instance. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, but my main concern is just feasibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. Mr. Spencer?
Thank you, Vice Chair. So one of the things that, I want to communicate here today is, clearly we are only 4 members of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission is a total of 14 people, 7 elected by the city and 7 elected by the county commission. So part of the reason we wanted to keep this smaller, though, was that so we could consolidate everybody's thoughts and really bring a clearer picture. And I think Councilman Driggs's comments are a good jumping off point for some of the concerns that we've heard from members of our Planning Commission. One in particular that was brought up by a couple members and affirmed by a couple members that I wanted to bring up is that the community views the 2040 plan as the guidance of future development to mitigate historical racial injustices in our community. The community is expecting the results of the 2040 plan to set a process for improvements to the historical minority neighborhoods that protects the residents from displacement while continuing the population and economic growth of the city. And these members of the Planning Commission had concerns that the initial draft of the 2040 plan and the equal priority as opposed to a clear priority order does not aggressively combat the market dynamics that have led to a large amount of resident displacement in historical minority neighborhoods. And we've had a couple members of the commission ask for more honest dialogue with the community on the problem of increasing density and affordability. So that's one comment from a couple commissioners who are not here today. The other one that I wanted to add based off Councilman Driggs's comments is that the councilman brought up the concept of transfer of wealth, where we prioritize our investments in neighborhoods. And I think that that goes directly to a concern that I and a couple others had when reading the plan, in that we talk about equity, but we don't have a clear definition of equity. And it should be very clear in our executive summary and our comprehensive plan that if that is one of our core values, we're defining what it is. And one of the definitions of equity is, like to use scripture from the book of Acts, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. And I think to the Councilman Driggs's point, if that is an expectation of the plan, it should be clear in our definition of equity that we are targeting our investment in neighborhoods that have not had an equitable distribution before. That should be crystal clear. And I think that the councilman's right that if that seems like a surprise, it's going to be very unpopular.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. Mr. Job, I believe you can continue.
Thank you. I'm going to actually hand off to Jay to go to the implementation and coordination, the creating complete communities. And then we can kind of respond to some of those things later on. So Jay?
Great. Thank you, Ty. I guess one thing that we wanted to do really briefly is touch on the idea of complete communities, which are made up of complete places. So a lot of time has been spent over multiple years now on place types. But just to really quickly move through this and then focus on the rest of the implementation strategy. This is a departure from traditional future land use planning, as well as the way a lot of comprehensive plans have been done historically. But it is a trend and a best practice of late. And the benefits of a place type approach, not only are we thinking about all areas of the community having, at least in close proximity, places to work, live, and play, but it provides flexibility within land use versus being extremely prescriptive, for parcel by parcel. It does think at a larger scale. It provides more direction on form, and then also integrates infrastructure needs, amenity needs to support the types of places that we're trying to create. So important to note, and I'll touch on it in a couple of slides here, but the place types, there's only 10 of them. So it's great that it's nice and simple and accessible and something you can wrap your arms around. But future steps will necessitate the Unified Development Ordinance assigning and defining zoning districts, a set of them associated with each place type. So it will not be a one-to-one. Each place type will likely have at least a handful of zoning districts, variety of those that can be assigned. Next slide. I haven't seen it advance yet. I don't know if others have. There you go. Great. Thank you. So to that end, similar to the place types needing a next step or two potentially in order to actually be codified and have the teeth that they need for implementation, there are admittedly other components of the plan that are similar. So the comprehensive plan does articulate a clear vision for the growth of the community, particularly through the equity lens. But the update to the Unified Development Ordinance, strategic action plans such as Charlotte Moves, the Tree Canopy Action Plan, looking at some of the county-wide efforts like the MEC Playbook and others, as well as then something that I'll touch on here in another slide or two as well, community area planning, and a specific update to the zoning map itself will be really critical in identifying location and quality of growth. That will then actually set up the implementation of the comprehensive plan and in the form of public development, private development, and which is going to incorporate capital improvement projects as well as other funding and financing tools. Next slide. So speaking of the specific direction, we've been having some small group conversations over the course of the last week since presenting to this committee and to the Planning Commission. And some of the questions that came up were, well, this is, we agree with a lot of the aspects of this. The 10 place types sound great, but when do we get the direction for development at a parcel by parcel level? This is hitting that directly. The comprehensive plan is phase 1. It's defining this idea of community area planning, which is in essence breaking the community into 15 different geographies. It's a departure from the multi-layered kind of approach of years past, where we have some very small neighborhood and area plans that tend to, before we can even kind of develop one for the entire community, tend to be outdated. So a lot of those plans, admittedly, some have actually been completed in the last couple of years or last 10 years. But there are many that are 25, 30 years old, nearly as old as the comprehensive plan itself, the old comprehensive plan. And so what we are doing within those community areas at this scale in the comprehensive plan is defining priorities in terms of the types of places that we'd like to create, what types of private investments would be needed, and then the public investments and community benefits we'd like to achieve with said investment. The next step will be upon adoption of the comprehensive plan, beginning ideally in April or May of 2021, going around each of these community areas and having a more detailed conversation with the folks that live, work, play in these areas about the places that they'd like to see and exactly where. And so while there's high-level direction on what types of places are needed within each of these geographies, we realized pretty quickly in the process, and this was just exacerbated with COVID-19 and the pandemic, that we needed to have more detailed hands-on conversation with community members to really do a good job and feel confident in the direction that's being provided with a area by area, ultimately parcel by parcel, future place type mapping. So that would be a target to be achieved by the end of 2021. That would then tee up the mapping of zoning districts. So depending on the place type mapping, that would begin to refine or kind of funnel down the number of zoning districts that would be applicable in a particular area or on a particular parcel. And there will then be a process similar to the TOD district mapping with additional community process to figure out and reaching out to property owners and whatnot to identify the specific zoning district. So that would be targeted in 2022. So the UDO, as everyone knows, is being worked on right now, but it would be refined and adopted through the course of 2021 during that future place type mapping. The idea would then be to circle back and try to develop a detailed plan for each of these community areas that would, in essence, provide direction on the types of specific projects and where those would be, thinking about prioritization of those projects and investments, as well as providing more detailed direction as needed, particularly for larger infill developments, corridors, so on and so forth, maybe greenfield developments if some of these areas have them, that may want to go a step further than the place type direction that's provided. Next slide.
Let's, Jay, if we could stay on that slide. I am assuming that there may be some process questions. But the reason I think this slide is important is some of it ties back to what Councilmember Driggs was just saying in terms of how does this translate to reality. So we are in that first phase right now of this comprehensive plan where we are talking about our priorities as a city for different planning areas. What investments will it take to make this happen? While they may seem like there will be some that are more important than others, yes, it's really that all of these things are codependent. They are all dependent on each other. For example, we're not going to create a 10-minute neighborhood next year or in 5 years' time. But that's the goal over the life of the plan. And everything we do from today till tomorrow will be to have that aspiration in front of us. That's where we want to go to. But that would drive investments, both public and private. It would drive priorities. It would drive our agenda. However, though, upon the adoption of this plan, we will begin to map the place types, which are 10 place types in total from next year. Think about your process for the transit-oriented development policy and ordinance that was adopted. This is the same process, but on a macro scale. Because unless we have, if we decide to map the place types today, the problem we're going to run into is that we end up engaging only people who can virtually participate and not the entire community. And you're likely going to miss some people. So we deliberately push that out. But we do have the 10 palettes and the framework that will guide what those place types will look like. And as we're working on the that's the phase 2, and that begins after the adoption of the plan. And as we walk through the UDO, remember that we started this whole process with just place types and UDO. If we had no comprehensive plan in the mix, we probably will be talking about adopting the UDO next year. But we pushed the UDO out to allow us enough time to set the vision and then set the place, map the place types. And while we're working on that, the UDO is taking on a life of its own, and that is due for adoption in 2022. Then comes the question that you all may have, and which we've heard from council and some of you as well, as what happens to the area plans? Do they all go away? So we've got about 115 area and district plans today, which is why we have in the situation where we are in terms of planning for our city. Those area plans will not necessarily go away, but they will be reduced in number. And that's what we're going to spend phase 4 working on. But you don't get to that place until you have a good sense of what the community has expressed as part of the place type mapping exercise. So I just wanted to stop here. So if there are questions from those online or from you, we can address those.
We do have at least 2 questions.
Ty, on developing community area plans, have we got an example of how someone else has done it? Because to me, that's something that starts in 2022, but it continues to go on as areas change, maybe transition from one place type to another, population goes here, there, whatever's the popular place. My concern is, how do we do that over time? And you guys may have examples of that or something. That's just a concern I have.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, we've actually set up similar processes as we develop the comprehensive plans for San Antonio and Denver. I'm also familiar with programs in Los Angeles, Portland, Oregon. I believe Nashville has a similar program. And the idea is generally that neighborhoods are too small of a unit for a variety of reasons. One, just the logistics of, if we were to do Denver, for example, there's 89 neighborhoods. The staff figured out based on resources that were available that it would take nearly 80 years to develop a plan for each of the neighborhoods. And of course, those, as you pointed out, those would be quickly outdated. So the idea is to group neighborhoods together. 1, for the logistics, 2, because you begin incorporating and being able to address some of the bigger issues within a neighborhood, which tend to actually be the boundaries of neighborhoods, major corridors, major greenways, parks, and that sort of thing. And then marching through, and so a piece of this is going to be prioritization. We won't be able to develop 15 community area plans all at once. So how are we prioritizing those based on equity indicators, based on market pressures, based on recent investment or growth like you were talking about? But stepping through all 15 areas in a relatively timely fashion. And then it would be an ongoing process. You would circle back and update those plans. At least every 10 years is what we'd recommend. Some communities do that as frequently as every 5 years. But again, it depends on resources, depends on the amount of change in an area. Matt has been really instrumental from EPS in helping us in formulate these types of programs and implementing them. We've been involved on this community area plan side as well. So Matt, anything you'd want to add to that?
Know that within the comprehensive plan in the implementation, we'll be providing direction on how we feel best to start prioritizing which plan areas to look at. And Jay mentioned it's a combination of equity, market issues. Also, we looked at how developed certain areas are. Areas that are greenfield may have different challenges than areas that are fully developed. And so trying to gauge the difference in terms of need and priority, we use, a set of factors typically, and that's worked well in other communities as well to create that prioritization.
Yeah, one final thing that I would say on that is the idea of breaking apart the future place type mapping and then developing the community area plans is in part because of the lag that occurs when kind of developing an overall process like this and detailed, community engagement and interaction. And so place type mapping, while it is a big lift, is something that can be achieved in a relatively timely manner, we think in the course of, 9 to 12 months. Whereas those community plans could take 9 to 12 months of keys. Maybe you're doing 3 to 5 of those at a time. So that is likely a longer timeline. So the future place type mapping would provide that direction in the shorter term, community area plans, more detailed direction in the mid to long term.
The last thing I would add is this setup allows the comprehensive plan to really provide that sort of vision and overarching umbrella for all the community area plans. So we can spend more time within this community area plan focusing on specific projects or issues or programs that are needed as opposed to trying to create visions that sometimes could be competing between different community plan areas. And so it really helps, I think, in terms of guiding CIP and implementation and bond issues, because you really have a process to identify the needs that the community has.
Just one more follow-up on that. These community area plans would be driven by staff, or would the area have autonomy to drive their own plans?
Very interesting question.
There are Karens out there, and I know they are in.
What triggers either the development, a rewrite, or a revision of a plan is not just staff. It could be community triggered. It could be council triggered. But staff still has to guide the process. And for the very reason that when we do that, it gives us context. We understand the financial context and all of that. So whether it's council that's triggering it or the community, at the end of the day, we'll still work on it. Part of the problems that we have today and why you still have area plans that were done in 1990-something that have not been updated is because the capacity isn't there. By the time you're done, it takes an average of 15 to 24 months to update an area plan today, and then you have about 115 of them. By the time you're done, it's probably outdated. And so the advantage of a comprehensive plan is that it sets the framework that while we're updating area plans, it has those policies that can guide. And yes, community, council, country, I will actually prefer that it's been triggered by council or community rather than staff, because then that's almost like top to bottom. But when it happens, though, we still have to have some criteria by which it's triggered. And then it will still have to be a resource capacity at that point.
If I can add to that process part just a little bit, what the comprehensive plan process will do also is give us a set of metrics in which we can report, monitor, and track every year, so we'll know where there's an area plan needed. And that we're looking holistically and prioritizing those areas. We've always had 100 or so plans, but when you do that area planning assessment process that guides you where the area of need might be, there are some areas who weren't experiencing growth or extreme issues where they needed an area plan. So that's one reason why they're old. But I also wanted to mention that in phase one of this process, it included a policy audit. It looked at all of the area plans, because there were some that were small that applied to, say, a university area that had really good principles that could apply to the entire community. So those are in the comprehensive plan. So those good things that we know we wanted to see applied on a more broader basis, they're in the plan. So it's not lost or won't go for nothing. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
Good, Ms. Weldon.
Good.
I've got Mr. Driggs, followed by Mr. Spencer.
Thank you. Mr. Spencer, I appreciated your comments. I did want to note that for most people, the idea of from each according to his ability and to each according to his need is associated with Karl Marx. And to a certain extent, that is my philosophical issue here is in every civilized, advanced society, there is a balance between the role of government and the activity of the private sector. And you need to let the private sector function in order to create the economic vitality that funds the aspirations of government. So striking the right balance between allowing people to make individual choices and businesses to make their choices freely, and then imposing the goals of the city on the choices they're able to make is kind of critical. I do think a lot of wealth redistribution is normal in a civilized society. But if you go too far, you end up, as various countries have experienced, basically stifling the vitality and the energy of the economy, and then you have less to work with in terms of trying to achieve the goals that we may establish as a government for the city. So that's a general observation. I think as far as the area plans are concerned, I'm sure Mr. Newton, at a minimum, is going to be very active in deciding what kind of plans occur in District 5, and I would be too. That process is part of what actually interests me about all of this, is how things like that develop. One thing that's difficult in all of this is if we put in the Silver Line and as part of this plan, and we think that that is going to realize the goal of having transit available to people of modest income, our experience on the Blue Line shows that what tends to happen is those become the most desirable destinations for millennials and for people with higher incomes. So the cost to the city of thwarting that market pressure, that tendency of people with higher incomes to aggregate around these transit corridors is going to be a major issue. We're going to have to find a way through land management, buying the properties, or doing whatever to actually create a situation in which the mass transit is very accessible to people in lower income housing, and particularly in locations that are more desirable because of their proximity to uptown. There are some market forces that dictate these things that we can't just wish away. I did have a question, and that is, if we look at the timeline on the current slide, what will our rezoning process look like while all of this is unfolding? I mean, I could see an environment that we're kind of already in, where we have outdated old plans and policies and codes and so on, and these new ones are taking shape, but they're not yet in place. So how do you imagine the zoning process will work while all of this is going on for the next couple of years?
Well, you won't like my answer, but it's kind of the way it's going on now. It's not satisfactory. That's why we are working on a comprehensive plan. However, this plan is scheduled to be adopted by Council in spring of next year. It will have an impact on the rezoning process from that time forward. Now, there are two ways to fast-track things. One of two ways before then. One is to say, all right, we have this draft document that's released on October 31. There are some great objectives in there. Let's begin to use them. The challenge we have with that is that it's not legally bound. and therefore it's hard to be able to use that and be able to defend the justification. However, the second piece of this is prior to council adopting in spring, we released this October 31. There's some really good guidance or guiding policies in the document. We can pull those forward and say interim guiding document that council can decide to approve to guide some rezoning petitions between now and the time that council eventually adopts the full document. We can take that approach.
The only issue I have there is I think we need clarity for the purposes of developers and petitioners about what the rules are and what the environment is. They spend money to develop their plans, and if there is a sort of qualitative aspect to the way these things get resolved, they don't know what to expect. So I agree with you. We're in a difficult situation now, and we're already making a lot of exceptions to area plans and saying this is not consistent, but, you know, public interest, et cetera. I was looking forward, you know, early next year to having more clarity. Then it looks like we will have more guidance on actual zoning decisions, and it looks like we will have before 2022 from what you're telling us here.
Yes.
So I just hope that we can articulate in the interim clearly what rules we're playing by and what is expected of people. And I will mention again my favorite subject, Providence Road. I've told people we're working on a plan, the 2040 plan, and it's going to kind of incorporate responses, or it will have sensitivity to this issue. And if it turns out it's not fully operational before 2022 or later, by the time we get all of the place types allocated to the various planning districts, then that's a long time for the people on Providence Road. And, you know, I've got a tough situation right now, but there are more in the wings waiting to happen. So that's why last year I started saying, could we have some sort of a congestion overlay that we could adopt in the interim that would state clearly what metrics we're going to use to decide what traffic impact is acceptable on Providence Road, and let everybody know when they propose to do development there, or when they negotiate the price of the land purchase on Providence Road, these are going to be the constraints on your ability to develop that land. So I hope you just think some more about how the zoning process will work along this timeline, and which of the intentions of the 2040 plan we're going to start to try to implement before we have it fully worked out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. Mr. Spencer?
Hey, I'll pass to Philip first.
Mr. Gussman?
Excellent. I was very happy to see this slide. This wasn't in our initial document, so I was like, oh, perfect, good. You answered a number of my questions with the one slide. Fantastic. To speak to the point of how the process goes, I do see our communities having and I think it would help the zoning process as well as soon as we get the place type map in there, because we are starting to see what the bucket of zoning districts are going to be within each of those place types. So it will give us some clarity through the process to address Mr. Driggs' point, which is valid, very. But I would also say that place typing mapping, if it is community involved as we're planning it and everything, it will also help, I think, a lot of our communities that are who are upset and unhappy that they don't have up-to-date area plans, even though they say that they're ready to help make them. Even just getting those maps down so that everyone can look and say, hey, this is the plan. We think we have, that's going to give some level of confidence. And I think it'll kick off, if we provide them a bit of a toolkit, everyone will be ready 6 months later, I think, to say, we're ready to help do our area plan. Now, we might not be able to handle it, I know, from a staffing perspective and everything. There might need to be a prioritization. But I know those communities will be ready to collect those, start creating those documents, as I know many are working to create vision plans now, just for their own benefit. That's it.
So really, really good insights from you and Councilmember Driggs, actually. But yesterday we had our Ordinance Advisory Committee met, and you were there in the meeting, and they, I believe, shared with you what two place types will look like, neighborhood 1 and neighborhood 2. And that's just an example of 2 out of 10. What we're going to do over the next few weeks is to develop a flow relationship between how all of these things will work so that it's easy for council, commission, community to understand what that will do. So maybe it's a very interesting way to quickly answer Councilman Madrig's question. Yes, you will have an answer before 2022, but we are also trying to do something where that we can come to you in January, both commission and council, to show you what that will look like from plan to place types to rezoning. That will help you to be able to make some decisions.
If I could add one additional thought, I love the mention of toolkits. We actually did that, mention the work in Denver. We helped create a suite of, I guess, tools, a toolkit in essence, for neighborhoods as they were waiting for, in Denver, it's called the Neighborhood Planning Initiative. So, and before that community area plan process started, they could do a sidewalk inventory. They could do some initial kind of visioning, conversations and think about how the comprehensive plan applies to their particular area. Identifying safety, doing a safety audit of the community. So that's something that we could and should, I think, articulate in the comprehensive plan implementation section. What are some of the at least potential or candidate components of that toolkit? Because as you said, it's unlikely you could begin all 15 of those plans, as soon as you're done with the place type mapping. So what do you do in the interim to prepare?
Mr. Spencer?
Yes, so one point of feedback, I know we had, almost every member of the commission I've talked to wants us to redo the zoning process, and I think that this is really great. The focus on community area planning makes it a lot easier because, for all intents and purposes, when we evaluate a rezoning, the area plans have become almost meaningless. Let's just say it. I know that there's one member of our committee who thinks that council should be, really focused on the community area plans and should be intimately involved with those. And I know that, this week we also had a meeting of the Citizen Advisory Committee on Governance, which is considering, what we do with the size, the composition of Charlotte City Council, and clearly, if we're going to this sort of area planning, and we want council to be intimately involved with these, then that's something that committee should consider when they talk about the composition of at-large members versus district members, because it does seem very clear that this comprehensive plan plus what we're looking at on other committees when it comes to governance could be a really good opportunity to have council involved with these new area plans. However, the other concern that I think we want to bring up here with the community planning areas is that while in the rezoning process, area plans are a consistent point of frustration, we definitely don't want to forget that there is a values component, and that often we vote for rezonings that are not entirely consistent with the stated values of the city, and I think that that's something that we need to look at more. And to the point that Councilman Driggs brought up about what are we doing in the interim before these community area plans become controlling. We've stated on Planning Commission that there are definitely things that we could do in the interim if there are good fixes before we do the entire UDO process or before we've completely rezoned based on place types.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. Not seeing any other questions, Mr. Joba.
So Jay, let's run through the next two slides and then Alicia can wrap up.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so again, this is Matt Prosser with EPS. We are working with city staff to develop a fiscal impact analysis for the comprehensive plan. And the purpose of this is to evaluate how growth patterns impact the fiscal health of the community. And so we're doing this both looking at an ongoing basis, you know, in 20 years, what will be the annual net impact of growth patterns, but also looking at it from a capital standpoint. And what we found, at least initially in our findings, is that the desired growth strategy that's articulated in the plan will actually create an increased benefit in terms of the net fiscal impact. So we'll actually be spending spending less than we would if we were traveling down the same growth pattern that we have. So in our more coordinated growth pattern, we're able to create more efficiencies in how we provide services and handle growth. We also found that high growth areas, places where a lot of market activity is occurring, there's a ton of value that's generated. And we have the opportunity to use existing tools, but also future tools to what we call capture that value and redirect that value back into the community, both in the areas where this high growth is occurring to mitigate impacts, but also to create community-wide benefits as well. And then the last thing is there are a few elements, both in the city and county, that we don't have adequate funding sources to maintain the quality of service or the amenities that we want from new development. So are there ways that we can try to address these lacks of funding tools so that new growth isn't having large impacts on these different services that are provided? Next slide, please.
Is that impact fees?
Potentially, yes. That's one potential tool that is worth considering, and something that we have within the comprehensive plan. This idea of cost recovery fees. That there are other approaches as well, but that is one that is worth considering. Obviously, there are legal challenges in the state of North Carolina that we have to address to be able to use those. And so part of the comprehensive plan implementation is to start to evaluate how we might be able to create a tool or something similar like that within the state and how we could advocate for that use. So within the comprehensive plan, we do have direction for how to pay for the plan. I mean, I think it's unrealistic to Councilmember Drake's point that we're going to be able to, as a city, pay for all the vision and investments that we have in this plan, and we recognize that. But there is an opportunity for us to use our existing funding tools like the CIP to achieve the vision. And so what we have in the comprehensive plan implementation section is guidance on how do we identify projects for the CIP, but also how do we prioritize the investment of the CIP funds on those projects. And so some changes to perhaps how the city currently does their CIP planning could flow out of this plan to better align it with the community vision. The second thing that we realized is we're probably going to need some new funding tools. So we just talked about potentially ways to recover costs of from new development on impacts they have to systems that we provide. Things that we've identified in the fiscal impact analysis are transportation being an issue where we may need to look at cost recovery type tools. Schools is another one that we heard from CMS is they really have a lack of dedicated funding or even any funding sources to deal with the growth of the facilities that they need to serve residents and new residents. And then also, how do we play with our existing and future tools to do a better job of value capture so that we are able to capture this great benefit we're getting out of these POD areas, these high growth areas like Uptown, and reinvest those in the amenities that we need to serve the new residents and jobs in those areas. So whether that's expansion of the way that you use tax increment grants now, perhaps using those different ways or other types of improvement district type setups that could achieve that. And the way that we're looking through that, or the lens that we're looking through that, is what I like to call shared prosperity. How do we bring the private sector and the community into the decision making and also the funding of some of these improvements? We've seen in other communities the use of things like business improvement districts and community benefit agreements where that the community and the business sector have both a say in the projects that the city is investing in, but also we're giving them the ability to raise their own funds to do things like marketing or invest in streetscape or build a park that they want. And so we recognize that it's not only the city's role to pay for new projects, it's not only the citizens' role in their taxes to pay for new projects. How do we involve the business community, the development community in a shared manner so that we are collectively all taking on a certain portion of this burden, but also providing more opportunity for citizens in the business community to have direct input and say in the investments that are made. So with that, I'll stop for any questions.
Mr. Driggs?
Yeah, thank you. I think the idea of creating more revenue tools for the city makes a lot of sense because it would enable us to allocate the costs in a more targeted fashion. If we rely too much on property tax, the burden that falls on people we don't want to burden is too great. So we can't just solve our revenue problem by jacking up property taxes and sales taxes. But I think there's also an issue of the total share of the economy that is controlled by government. And so as we talk about these new revenue tools, we have to add them all up, and we have to be mindful of what the migration is of control of the economy and of resources from the private sector to the public sector. And that's the thing that I think if we were trying to accomplish everything that's in here would tip in a bad direction. And I mean, I'll just point to things like if you try to, if you set yourself a goal of a housing map environment that is very different from what would happen if you just let the private sector and individuals make their respective choices, it's going to take some sort of economic investment, or there will be dislocations from trying to achieve that, and they aren't without consequence. So I don't know whether that type of thing is captured here, but the point I made before about the property along those transit corridors, in market terms, that becomes some of the most desirable property. And our goal is to make it some of the most accessible property. The difference between what the market would value that property at and the rate at which we want to make it available to people has to be accounted for. And in very sort of general mental arithmetic, I see the numbers involved in doing that getting astronomical. So one suggestion I wanted to make is that we pursue these goals partly on the basis of evidence, that we do the same thing that we're doing in our crime area and look at where the biggest successes have been in these areas in other places and learn from what they did in order to achieve that, so that we are informed as we move forward by some real world reference as to what is feasible. Because we can sit here and talk to each other about this and we can dream, and nobody has actually accomplished everything that this plan describes. So let's just start to get smarter about best practices and biggest successes elsewhere and see how we can incorporate them into this process and to help us allocate resources and set priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. Anybody else have a question before we continue? Ms. Samuel, make sure you turn on your mic.
There were many opportunities provided by staff, thank you, for engagement by the community and residents of our city. In those engagement sessions, we heard very clearly, many of which were attended by commission members here at the table. In every single one of those engagement sessions that we sat through, we heard very clearly from the residents that equity was one of the most important items to prioritize as we developed the comp plan. It is of note that government policy, tools, and processes helped create some of the inequities that exist in our city. It helped create some of the wealth gap that exists in the community. And I think that it will take government tools, processes, and policy to kind of undo some of that damage. Many of our commissioners feel that the UDO and the comp plan are both tools that can help do that. It's important for me particularly to see language and policy that encourages the reversal of some of that damage. And so I'm encouraged to see this slide here and some of the definitions that Matt have provided around the slide in terms of the language that the comp plan might help encourage some of the tools that might be in our toolbox to accomplish some of the goals and priorities of that comp plan. In terms of area plans, I'm encouraged that council is very interested in helping to create and shape and partner with the community in creation of that plans. The Planning Commission kind of counts on that. As a resident of the city myself, I kind of count.
If I can get everybody to make sure they're muted, we're getting some feedback in the room at least. Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay. I count on council also to help shape an economic environment in the city that brings together community and private sector without either side feeling choked by city policy. So I will definitely encourage to see the rest of this presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Samuel. Anybody else before we continue? If I can get everybody as well to make sure once they've gone to lower their hand there so we don't get confused as we move forward with who's got questions. Mr. Jaoba.
I will end with this slide, and that is the process going forward. First of all, I will say again, I really thank all of you for devoting your Friday afternoon to this. It definitely shows to us, as staff, that this is important to you, your fellow council members and your fellow commissioners. So really appreciate that. I can't say that enough. But going forward is actually the big lift now. Once this public draft hits the street on October 31st, we are going to have to start responding to community comments, whether that community is defined as residents, advocacy groups, business community, development community. We are going to start responding to that. But the request I will make of you is that if there's any group out there that wants us to come and speak to them, share processes, whether they be neighborhood groups or they be business communities, we'd be glad to do that. We understand that this is going to be shared online and some people may not have access to internet and be able to review this, so I will make myself available as the reopening continues to be phased, where we can meet with people, 10 people at a time, 20, 25. We will be happy to do that because this, in my mind, is the most important part of this plan. Yes, we need to be able to let people know that what we've heard from them over the last 2 years, like Commissioner Samuel said, whether we've reflected them in this plan or we have not, it's important for them to critique this plan, to validate some of our assumptions, some of the proposals and suggestions we're making. But I really would like, the way I like to see it is that this becomes a community document, a people-driven effort, that they feel that there is transparency in the process. And so what we will share the highlights of the draft document with council on October 26th. We will release the draft document, the public draft, to council, commission, and community on October 31st, and it will go through a 6-month review and adoption process. And adoption will be March or April of next year. This is the first time in all the years I've been working on a comprehensive plan that we actually gave that length of time for review. And I'm glad we did at the beginning because we never anticipated COVID-19 when we did that. We just thought the reasoning behind it was this is the first comprehensive plan in 45 years. Let's give people ample time to review it. But I'm glad that we did because then we're in this public health situation. So starting from October 31st, we're going to have that drive-in engagement at the Park Expo and Conference Center. The way we've done it is to have 4 sessions, starting at 1 p.m., and people will drive in, sit in their vehicles, and there will be space between vehicles. We've been having conversation with our public health colleagues to make sure that everybody is wearing their mask and they're not coming out of their vehicle to be mingling around. So there will be people there who will be citing people who violate some of the requirements. But at the end of the day, if everything goes well, we intend to see about 1,200 people face-to-face, and then end that evening with the movie Back to the Future. It is also going to give us an opportunity to really hear from the people, from the community, present the plan to everyone, so that way we start that engagement process. It's the kickoff, really, of the engagement process. So we're asking you, today we will send out the executive summary, and that's available. But the public draft itself will be out on October 31, and I will encourage you to share those with your network as much as possible. But we'll be happy to start meeting with people and working through that process from that time on. We definitely want to be as bold and aspirational as possible, but we also want to make sure that, everyone from teenagers to our seniors have an opportunity to participate in this process beginning from October 31. So I'll end there, and if there are questions with regards to logistics, maybe Alicia can add more to that. Thank you.
If a citizen or a council member wanted to bring food and drinks and tailgate at this event, would that be allowed?
That's not safe.
I think we need trays with burgers on the driver's side window.
We'll have Mr. Driggs. We'll get you to break out your roller skates, and you can deliver those burgers to the cars.
I'm there, man. Count me in.
I've been told that no, I'm not allowed to bring a tailgate. That's not safe.
No,
But
we'll give you snacks to have in your bags.
but the park.
You get 2,000 people if you do the tailgate. The numbers
Exactly.
are way up.
The park does have a nice big parking lot, though, so we ought to be able to accommodate as many people as want to come. Will that be? I see it's 2 to 9.
Yes.
People come, should they anticipate being there for 30 minutes, 60 minutes?
I think when people come, 45 minutes?
So programs about 45 minutes.
Yeah.
That's from beginning to end.
Yeah, so 45 minutes per session.
And then
And they can come whenever, or it starts on the hour every hour?
starts on the hour. Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect.
And the one thing I forgot to mention is that we will have this in both English and Hispanic, so there will be bilingual. Yes. As people sit in their vehicle, they can tune into a particular station that will broadcast in their language to them, so that way they can understand and they may be able to ask questions. So this will be bilingual. Probably the first time anybody will be doing this nationally, frankly speaking, on a plan during this time. So we think we're setting a tone for something here, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that everything works out well.
If you see somebody pulling with a big RV, you'll know that's me. Since I can't have football tailgates, I got to find something to tailgate. This might be it. Do we have any other questions before we wrap today?
Just want to close out with something.
Yes, sir, Mr. Spencer.
So the final thing that I think every member of the commission has wanted me to convey is that we're very impressed by the public outreach for the comprehensive plan here. I think that with incredible challenges, the Planning, Design, and Development Department has done an incredible job making sure that we are able to reach out to all over the community and continuing that process over the next 6 months. It is something that we're very thankful for, and of course we'll be looking forward to hearing that input as we and then the council review and approve the comprehensive plan. But would be remiss, a lot of the effort and energy from our planning commission has also been on affordable housing. A lot of, obviously, our city's energy has been on that issue. We continue to care very deeply about it, and to Kiba's points earlier, it is a government policy choice. When we see somebody who can't access their house, who can't afford to pay rent, that's a policy choice. When we pass Tent City on 12th Street, that's a policy choice. And so I think it is it's so important for all of us to be engaged in these choices because we're really going to set the entire tone for the city for years to come.
Here, here. Thank you, Mr. Spencer. With that, I will entertain a motion from Mr. Driggs or Mr. Newton to adjourn.
Move, Mr. Chair.
So moved.
It sounded like a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye. And I appreciate everyone's time today. Hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. We are adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.